What if I told you that NASCAR mechanics once found a way to stuff 2 extra gallons of fuel into a regulation tank without modifying a single part? No fancy engineering, no illegal modifications, just pure, calculated physics that bent the rules so hard they had to rewrite the book. Picture this. It's the 1960s, and you're standing in the garage at Daytona International Speedway. The air is thick with the smell of high-octane racing fuel and burning rubber. Teams are preparing for a 500-mile battle where every pit stop could mean the difference between kissing the trophy or kissing your career goodbye. The best crews could change 4 tires and dump 22 gallons of fuel in under 20 seconds. But what if you didn't need that last pit stop at all? This is the story of how one brilliant mechanic discovered a loophole in the laws of physics that NASCAR never saw coming. A trick so simple, so elegant, and so effective that when officials finally caught on, they had to scramble to ban it before it changed the sport forever. We're talking about the infamous fuel freezing technique that turned chemistry into a competitive advantage and made NASCAR officials lose sleep over thermometers. To understand why freezing fuel was such a game changer, we need to travel back to NASCAR's Wild West days. This was the era when stock car was more of a suggestion than a rule. The 1960s NASCAR circuit was a proving ground where innovation meant survival. Teams were running cars that pushed 180 miles per hour on the high banks of Daytona and Talladega, burning through fuel at rates that would make a modern hybrid owner faint. The competition was brutal. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were locked in an all-out war for supremacy. Factory teams had virtually unlimited budgets. Independent teams scraped by on ingenuity and determination. The rule book was thinner than a diner menu, and if it wasn't explicitly illegal, it was fair game. This was the environment that bred the kind of creative thinking that would lead to the fuel-freezing revolution. Racing in this era was about pushing every boundary. Teams would acid-dip body panels to make them lighter. They'd bore out engine blocks until they were paper thin. They'd reshape aerodynamic components when inspectors weren't looking. But fuel capacity, that was supposed to be sacred. NASCAR mandated a maximum 22-gallon fuel cell for superspeedways, no exceptions, no modifications, no negotiations. The problem was simple but devastating. At superspeedway races like Daytona and Talladega, cars were running wide open for 500 miles. The big block V8 engines of the era were magnificent beasts, but terrible on fuel economy. A typical NASCAR engine of the late 1960s was displacing 427 cubic inches, running compression ratios around 12.1 and producing north of 500 horsepower. At full throttle, these engines consumed fuel at a rate of about 5 miles per gallon, sometimes less. Do the math. 500 miles at 5 miles per gallon means 100 gallons of fuel needed. With a 22-gallon tank, that's a minimum of 4 pit stops just for fuel, assuming you could run the tank completely dry, which you couldn't. In reality, teams were stopping 5, sometimes 6 times. Each stop cost at least 30 seconds under green flag conditions. That's 2.5 to 3 minutes spent sitting still while your competition is doing 180 miles per hour. But here's where it gets interesting. Some genius mechanic, whose identity has been lost to history, though many claim credit, realized something fundamental about liquid physics. Fuel, like all liquids, contracts when it gets cold. The colder it gets, the denser it becomes. The denser it becomes, the more mass you can fit in the same volume. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Gasoline has a coefficient of thermal expansion of approximately 0.095 per degree Celsius. That might not sound like much, but let's break down what it actually means. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a typical race day temperature, 22 gallons of fuel takes up 22 gallons of space. Obvious, right? But cool that same fuel down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, and something magical happens. The fuel contracts. Those same 22 gallons now take up only about 21.5 gallons of space. That means you can add another half gallon to the tank and still be legal. But why stop there? Teams discovered they could cool the fuel even further. Using a combination of dry ice and alcohol baths, they could bring fuel temperatures down to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, the contraction was even more dramatic. Some crew chiefs claimed they could squeeze an extra 1.5 to 2 gallons into a regulation fuel cell. That's nearly a 10% increase in fuel capacity without touching the tank itself. The execution was an art form. Teams would store their fuel in refrigerated trucks, keeping it as cold as possible until the last moment. Some used modified beer coolers filled with dry ice. Others built elaborate cooling systems that circulated refrigerant around the fuel containers. The most sophisticated operations had temperature-controlled fuel storage that could maintain precise temperatures for hours. On race day, the ballet would begin. Fuel would be transferred from the refrigerated storage to the dump cans just minutes before a pit stop. The dump cans themselves were sometimes pre-cooled with liquid nitrogen. Crew members wore thick gloves, not just for safety, but because the metal fuel cans were so cold, they could cause frostbite. You could actually see condensation forming on the outside of the fuel cans in the humid southern air, like a cold beer on a hot day. The physics didn't stop at just fitting more fuel in the tank. Cold fuel had other advantages that teams were quick to exploit. When cold fuel enters a hot engine, it absorbs heat from the intake manifold and combustion chamber. This cooling effect increases the density of the air-fuel mixture, potentially allowing for more aggressive ignition timing and slightly more power. We're talking maybe 5 to 10 extra horsepower, but in a sport where races were won by fractions of a second, every bit counted. Cold fuel also vaporized differently. The carburetor jets that were perfectly calibrated for 70-degree fuel would run slightly rich with near-freezing fuel. Some crew chiefs saw this as a problem, others saw it as an opportunity. By intentionally running cold fuel with specifically calibrated carburetors, they could create a richer mixture that provided better cooling for the engine under extreme stress. This could mean the difference between an engine surviving 500 miles and detonating on the backstretch. The strategic implications were staggering. Consider a typical 500-mile superspeedway race. With standard fuel temperature and capacity, a car might need to pit every 90 to 100 miles. That's 5 stops minimum. But with an extra 2 gallons per tank from fuel cooling, plus better fuel economy from the denser mixture, a car could potentially stretch its runs to 110 or even 115 miles. That's one less pit stop over the course of a race. Eliminating a pit stop wasn't just about the 30 seconds saved in the pits. It was about track position, clean air, and avoiding the accordion effect of the pack. It meant you could stay out when others pitted, inherit the lead, and control the race pace. It meant you could avoid the dangerous pit road traffic that had ended many promising runs. It was a tactical nuclear weapon in an era where strategy was becoming as important as speed. The earliest adopters of fuel cooling kept it secret as long as possible. But in the close-quarters world of NASCAR, secrets don't stay secret for long. By the mid-1960s, eagle-eyed crew members started noticing the telltale signs. Frost on fuel cans, teams with unusually elaborate fuel handling equipment, cars that seemed to run impossibly long on a single tank of fuel. The cat-and-mouse game began. NASCAR officials, already overwhelmed trying to police aerodynamic modifications and engine tricks, now had to worry about fuel temperature. How do you even check for something like that? Early attempts at enforcement were almost comical. Officials would stick thermometers in fuel tanks, but by the time they got there, the fuel had already started warming up. Teams would argue about ambient temperature, storage temperature, and transport temperature. Some teams got creative with their deception. They'd have two sets of fuel cans, one set at normal temperature for inspection, another set supercooled for actual use. They'd time their fuel delivery so the coldest fuel went in during the chaos of a pit stop when officials were distracted. One legendary crew chief allegedly had his team spray the outside of warm fuel cans with CO2 to make them look cold during inspection. The tech inspection battles became legendary. NASCAR would mandate that fuel be stored at ambient temperature. Teams would argue about what constituted ambient in an air-conditioned garage. NASCAR would require fuel temperature checks. Teams would develop ways to rapidly warm fuel just before inspection. It was an arms race fought with thermometers and stopwatches. Let's look at a specific race to understand the real impact. The 1967 Daytona 500, won by Mario Andretti, saw several teams suspected of using supercooled fuel. Andretti's Holman Moody Ford ran the entire 500 miles with just 4 pit stops, while several competitors needed 5. That extra stop cost those teams over a minute under green flag conditions. In a race decided by margins of seconds, it wasn't even close. Post-race inspection found nothing illegal about Andretti's fuel system. The tank was regulation size. The fuel was regulation octane. But several competitors complained that they'd seen frost on the Holman Moody fuel cans during pit stops. NASCAR officials were in a bind. There was no rule about fuel temperature. How could they penalize a team for following the laws of physics? The controversy reached a boiling point, or perhaps a freezing point, during the 1968 season. Richard Petty's team, running the famous .43 Plymouth, was accused of using fuel cooled to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's colder than a typical home freezer. At that temperature, they could theoretically fit almost 3 extra gallons in their tank. Petty went on to win 16 races that season, though he always maintained they were simply maximizing their fuel strategy within the rules. The scientific arms race escalated quickly. Teams hired chemical engineers to calculate optimal fuel temperatures. They experimented with different fuel blends that had better thermal expansion characteristics. Some tried adding substances to the fuel that would lower its freezing point, allowing for even more extreme cooling. One team allegedly experimented with liquid nitrogen injection directly into the fuel tank, though this proved too dangerous to implement. The safety concerns were real and mounting. Supercooled fuel created several hazards. First, there was the risk of frostbite for crew members handling the frozen cans. Second, the extreme temperature differential between cold fuel and hot engine components created thermal stress that could crack fuel lines or damage carburetors. Third, and most concerning, was the risk of fuel separation. Some fuel components could actually begin to solidify at extreme cold temperatures, potentially causing engine failure. There was also the competitive integrity issue. Fuel cooling technology wasn't cheap. The refrigeration equipment, insulated storage, and specialized handling gear could cost tens of thousands of dollars. This gave well-funded factory teams yet another advantage over independent racers. The gap between the haves and have-nots was growing wider, threatening the competitive balance of the sport. NASCAR found itself in an impossible position. How do you regulate temperature? Unlike mechanical modifications that could be measured and banned, temperature was ephemeral. Fuel that was illegal at the moment of filling could be perfectly legal by the time it reached the engine. The physics of heat transfer meant that enforcement would always be playing catch-up. The teams, meanwhile, were pushing the boundaries even further. One innovative crew chief developed a system where the fuel cell itself was cooled between races. By storing the entire car in a refrigerated trailer and cooling the fuel cell walls, they could keep the fuel colder for longer once it was added. The cold mass of the fuel cell acted like a giant ice cube, maintaining low fuel temperatures well into the race. Another team experimented with phase-change materials in false-bottomed fuel cans. These materials would absorb heat as they melted, keeping the fuel above them cold for extended periods. It was like having a built-in cooling system that required no power and left no evidence. The ingenuity was remarkable, even if it was bending the spirit of competition. The tipping point came during the 1969 Talladega 500. This race was already controversial due to tire safety concerns, with many top drivers boycotting. Those who did race pushed the fuel cooling envelope to its absolute limit. Multiple teams were running fuel so cold that condensation was forming ice crystals on the fuel cell vents. The disparity in pit stop strategies was obvious to everyone watching. The winner, Richard Brickhouse, made one less stop than several competitors, largely thanks to fuel strategy. The post-race tech inspection turned into a chemistry lesson, with officials trying to determine not just if the fuel was cold, but how cold and when it had been cooled. The rule book had nothing to say about any of it. Brickhouse kept the win, but NASCAR knew something had to change. The public was starting to notice too. Television commentators struggled to explain why some cars could run so much longer than others on the same size fuel tank. Fans who understood the trick appreciated the ingenuity. Others felt it was against the spirit of fair competition. The fuel temperature controversy was becoming a public relations problem for NASCAR. Behind closed doors, NASCAR officials met with team owners and crew chiefs. The message was clear. Either the teams would self-regulate or NASCAR would impose draconian measures. Some suggested random fuel temperature checks during the race. Others proposed standardized fuel supplied by NASCAR. The nuclear option was spec fuel systems with temperature sensors that would disqualify any car running fuel below a certain temperature. The teams pushed back hard. They argued that fuel cooling was no different than other forms of preparation. Teams cooled their tires to precise temperatures. They heated their oil to specific viscosities. Why should fuel be any different? It was all part of the science of racing, they claimed. Banning innovation would stifle the technological development that made NASCAR exciting. But NASCAR had made up its mind. For the 1970 season, a new rule appeared in the book, Rule 14.5a, seemingly innocuous among hundreds of other technical regulations. Fuel must be maintained at a temperature no lower than 50 degrees Fahrenheit as measured at the time of delivery to the vehicle. Simple, clear, enforceable, sort of. Teams immediately found loopholes. The rule said, at the time of delivery, but what about before delivery? Could you cool the fuel to 30 degrees and then let it warm to 50 just before pouring? What about cooling the fuel cans, but not the fuel itself? What if the ambient temperature was below 50 degrees? The lawyers were having a field day. NASCAR responded with clarifications and amendments. Random temperature checks would be conducted in the garage and on pit road. Teams had to provide access to their fuel storage at all times. Any attempt to artificially cool fuel below the minimum temperature would result in disqualification. The penalties were severe, and NASCAR meant business. The 1970 season became a test case for the new rules. Early races saw multiple teams penalized for fuel temperature violations. Some were minor infractions, fuel at 48 degrees instead of 50. Others were blatant, with fuel found at near freezing temperatures. NASCAR officials carried digital thermometers and conducted spot checks throughout race weekends. The teams adapted, as they always do. If they couldn't cool the fuel, they'd find other advantages. Some focused on fuel pickup improvements, ensuring they could run the tank completely dry without fuel starvation. Others worked on aerodynamics to improve fuel economy. The innovation didn't stop, it just changed direction. One particularly clever team developed what they called thermal management strategy. They couldn't cool the fuel below 50 degrees, but they could heat everything else. By running higher engine temperatures and heating the fuel rails, they created a larger temperature differential when the legal 50-degree fuel entered the system. This still provided some of the cooling benefits without breaking the rules. Another team focused on fuel formulation. Working with petroleum engineers, they developed fuel blends that had better expansion characteristics while still meeting NASCAR's chemical requirements. It wasn't as effective as supercooling, but every fraction of a gallon counted. The chemistry war replaced the temperature war. The enforcement challenges continued through the early 1970s. NASCAR had to invest in sophisticated temperature monitoring equipment. They hired additional inspectors trained in thermal measurement. The cost of policing fuel temperature was significant, but NASCAR felt it was necessary to maintain competitive integrity. Some teams never gave up trying. In 1973, a creative crew chief was caught using CO2 cartridges hidden inside hollow frame rails to cool the fuel cell during the race. The system was activated by a hidden switch, dropping the fuel temperature by 10 degrees in seconds. It was ingenious, illegal, and resulted in a massive fine and suspension. The modern era brought new challenges and solutions. By the 1980s, NASCAR had standardized fuel cells with temperature sensors. Electronic monitoring made it nearly impossible to cheat without detection. The Wild West days of fuel cooling were over, but the legend lived on. Today's NASCAR runs EFI systems with precise fuel management. The cars are more efficient, the fuel cells are smaller, and the racing is just as intense. But talk to any old-timer in the garage, and they'll tell you stories about the days when chemistry was as important as horsepower. When a mechanic with a thermometer and some dry ice could outsmart million-dollar racing teams. The fuel cooling era taught NASCAR valuable lessons about rules enforcement and competitive balance. It showed that racers will always push boundaries, exploit loopholes, and turn science into speed. It demonstrated that innovation in racing doesn't always come from the engineering department. Sometimes it comes from understanding the fundamental properties of the materials you're working with. The technique itself has found applications outside of racing. Industrial operations use similar principles to maximize fuel storage efficiency. Aviation companies calculate fuel density at different temperatures to optimize payload capacity. The racing world's discovery became the industrial world's standard practice. Looking back, the fuel freezing trick was more than just a clever hack. It represented the spirit of innovation that makes motorsports compelling. It was David versus Goliath, if David had a chemistry degree and access to industrial refrigeration. It was proof that in racing, the biggest advantages often come from the smallest details. The human element makes this story even more fascinating. Picture the mechanic who first proposed this idea. Maybe he'd worked in refrigeration before racing. Maybe he'd noticed his beer got colder faster when he put salt on the ice. Whatever the inspiration, he looked at a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable and found a solution in basic physics. Think about the crew chief who had to sell this to his driver. "We're going to put frozen fuel in your car." The driver probably thought he was crazy until that first race when they made one less pit stop than everyone else. Until they watched competitors run out of fuel while they still had gallons in reserve. Until the checkered flag flew and they were in victory lane. Consider the NASCAR officials who had to figure out how to stop it. They weren't just fighting teams, they were fighting the laws of thermodynamics. How do you write a rule against physics? How do you enforce something that changes with every passing second? It was like trying to regulate the weather. The legacy of fuel cooling lives on in today's NASCAR. Modern teams still push every boundary, exploit every gray area, find every advantage. They might not be freezing fuel anymore, but they're doing something. That's the nature of racing. That's what makes it beautiful. When you watch a modern NASCAR race with its laser-inspected bodies and computer-controlled engines, remember that it wasn't always this way. There was a time when winning meant more than having the fastest car. It meant being the smartest, the most creative, the most willing to challenge conventional thinking. The fuel freezing era proved that, in racing, innovation doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it comes from the quiet corner of the garage where someone's doing something that seems impossible. Something that makes other teams scratch their heads and officials reach for their rulebooks. That's the real lesson here. Racing isn't just about speed. It's about problem solving. It's about finding advantages where others see limitations. It's about turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. A regulation fuel tank that holds 22 gallons? That's a limitation. Unless you understand chemistry, then it's an opportunity. Today's engineers have computers, simulation software, and advanced materials. But they're still fighting the same battle those mechanics fought with thermometers and ice. They're still looking for that edge, that fraction of a second, that one less pit stop that could mean the difference between winning and watching someone else celebrate. The banned fuel freezing trick added 2 extra gallons per tank. But it added something more important to racing history. It added a chapter about ingenuity triumphing over resources, about chemistry becoming strategy, about mechanics who understood that sometimes the best engineering solution isn't mechanical at all. When NASCAR finally regulated fuel temperature, they weren't just closing a loophole. They were acknowledging that racers had once again proven themselves smarter than the rules. They were admitting that innovation in racing comes from unexpected places. They were recognizing that in the pursuit of speed, even the temperature of fuel becomes a weapon. The next time you fill up your car on a cold morning and notice the pump running slower, remember those NASCAR mechanics. Remember that they turned that same property of cold fuel into a competitive advantage that changed racing. Remember that they looked at physics and saw opportunity where others saw only limitation. That's what makes motorsports special. It's not just about who has the most money or the best equipment. It's about who sees the world differently, who understands that every rule has a boundary, every limitation has an exception, and every problem has a solution if you're willing to think outside the conventional. The fuel freezing story is more than racing history. It's a reminder that innovation often comes from questioning the unquestionable. It's proof that sometimes the biggest advantages come from the smallest details. It's evidence that in the pursuit of victory, human creativity will always find a way. Those mechanics who cooled their fuel to near freezing didn't just find 2 extra gallons. They found a truth about racing that still holds today. The team that wins isn't always the fastest. Sometimes it's the smartest. Sometimes it's the one that understands that in racing, like in life, the rules of physics are the only rules that really matter. What's the most creative rule bending you've ever heard of in motorsports? Drop a comment below and share your favorite story of racing innovation. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into NASCAR's wild chemistry experiment, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started exploring the incredible engineering stories that shaped racing history.